Hello everyone, and welcome back to the channel. This is the first episode of my new series, One Rig. In this episode, we're testing the RTX 5080 paired with the Ryzen 7 7800 X3D across 10 different games. All tests were performed at two resolutions, 1440p and 4K. As always, you can find more information about the test setup and settings in the description below. And if you enjoy the video, don't forget to subscribe. That way, you won't miss any future benchmarks, and it also helps me continue growing the channel. So, if you're ready, let's get started. We're starting this episode with one of my favorite games when it comes to path tracing, Cyberpunk 2077 Phantom Liberty. For this test, I'll be using the Ray Tracing Overdrive Quick preset. This preset automatically enables DLSS Auto, Ray Reconstruction, and full path tracing, while the rest of the graphics settings are set to High and Ultra. Here you can see the game running at 1440p, and honestly, it looks really good. All the reflections on the wet roads and the car body look amazing. It really makes you want to keep playing. In terms of performance, the average frame rate stays at around 80 FPS, with the 1% low at roughly 65 FPS. The graphics card draws around 300 watts. As for the CPU, average usage sits at about 52%, with an average power draw of around 46 watts. In 4K, the average frame rate sits at around 55 FPS, with the 1% low at roughly 46 FPS. GPU power consumption increases to around 318 watts. CPU usage drops slightly to about 48%, while the average CPU power draw remains almost the same as it was at 1440p. At 4K, we're getting close to 60 FPS, although it's not quite a locked 60. Overall, the RTX 5080 handles the game really well. You can comfortably play at 4K using the highest preset, while still getting a smooth and enjoyable experience. Moving on, our next game is Pragmata. For this test, path tracing and ray tracing are enabled, with DLSS set to quality. At 1440p, the average frame rate sits at around 73 FPS, with the 1% low at roughly 62 FPS. The game feels smooth, and the 1% low stays fairly close to the average, so there are no major drops during gameplay. GPU power consumption reaches around 330 watts, which is getting very close to the factory power limit. With path tracing enabled, the graphics card is clearly doing most of the work here. CPU usage sits at only around 16%, with an average power draw of roughly 29 watts. This shows that, at least in this area, Pragmata is much more demanding on the graphics card than on the processor. When it comes to 4K, I have some bad news for anyone hoping to stay close to 60 FPS. With these settings, the average frame rate drops to around 42 FPS, with the 1% low at roughly 37 FPS. GPU usage stays at 99%, while power consumption reaches around 360 watts. So the game is pushing the RTX 5080 as hard as it can, but even then, it still struggles to get anywhere near 60 FPS. Just like at 1440p, the CPU has very little to do here. Average usage sits at only around 11%, with a power draw of roughly 26 watts. Overall, 4K is still playable, but it's definitely not the best choice if you're looking for a smooth 60 FPS experience. Next up, we have Death Stranding 2 on the beach. For this test, DLSS is set to quality. The preset is custom, and almost every graphics setting is pushed as high as the game allows. Starting with 1440p, performance in this particular area is really good. We're getting around 114 FPS on average, with the 1% low sitting at roughly 89 FPS, so the game feels very smooth. Of course, performance can vary depending on the location. Average GPU power consumption sits at around 271 watts. CPU usage is around 61%, with an average power consumption of roughly 54 watts. In 4K, the average frame rate drops to around 81 FPS, with the 1% low sitting at roughly 68 FPS. That's still a really good result, especially considering that almost every graphics setting is pushed to the maximum. GPU power consumption increases to around 312 watts. What's interesting here is the CPU usage. In many games, moving up to 4K usually means the CPU has much less work to do, but Death Stranding 2 is clearly different. Even at 4K, CPU usage stays relatively high, at around 53%, with an average power draw of roughly 51 watts. So this game still demands quite a lot from the processor, even at this resolution. Visually, Death Stranding 2 looks great, but effects like reflections and lighting are much more subtle than in something like Cyberpunk 2077. Overall, the RTX 5080 handles 4K really well here, delivering around 80 FPS while keeping the image quality at a very high level. Moving on, we have Black Myth Wukong. For this test, DLSS is set to quality, with the resolution scale at 89%. That's basically the highest value you can use before the game switches over to DLAA. Ray tracing is set to very high, and the overall preset is cinematic. Starting with 1440p, you can immediately see how demanding this game is at these settings, but at the same time, the visual quality really explains why. Just look at the shadows, the amount of detail in the trees, or even the bridge we passed earlier. Everything looks incredibly detailed. In terms of performance, we're getting around 62 FPS on average, with the 1.7 low at roughly 46 FPS, so the gameplay still feels smooth. GPU power consumption sits at around 295 watts. The CPU, on the other hand, has a much easier time here, with average usage at around 25% and a power draw of roughly 36 watts. In 4K, things get much more demanding. The average frame rate drops to around 34 FPS, with the 1% low sitting at roughly 28 FPS. So with these settings, we're clearly far away from a smooth 60 FPS experience. The game still looks fantastic, but 4K with cinematic settings and very high ray tracing is simply too much if you're aiming for high frame rates. GPU power consumption increases to around 333 watts. CPU usage drops to only around 16%, with an average power draw of roughly 30 watts. So at 4K, the graphics card is doing almost all of the heavy lifting. Overall, the RTX 5080 can run these settings, but for smoother gameplay in 4K, I would definitely reduce the ray tracing level, or use a more aggressive DLSS setting. Moving on to something a bit faster, Forza Horizon 6. For this test, we're using DLSS quality with the built-in Extreme Plus RT preset. At 1440p, performance is excellent. We're getting around 123 FPS on average, with the 1% low sitting at roughly 87 FPS, so the game feels incredibly smooth. Average GPU power consumption is around 259 watts. What's interesting here is the CPU usage, which reaches around 63%, with an average power draw of roughly 53 watts. The processor definitely has more work to do in this area, with the city, buildings, traffic, and a lot of objects being processed at the same time. Even so, with this setup, the game runs phenomenally well and looks really impressive at the same time. In 4K, performance is still really strong. The average frame rate sits at around 82 FPS, with the 1% low at roughly 65 FPS, so the game still feels very smooth, even at this resolution. GPU power consumption increases to around 307 watts. CPU usage drops to around 39%, with an average power draw of roughly 42 watts. That's lower than at 1440p, but the processor is still doing a fair amount of work here. Visually, the reflections on the car body look really good, especially with this black paint. You can clearly see the surrounding buildings and other objects reflected across the surface, and it adds a lot to the overall look of the game. Overall, Forza Horizon 6 runs extremely well on the RTX 5080 at 4K. With the Extreme Plus RT preset, you're still getting a very smooth experience without having to sacrifice image quality. Now it's time for Mafia, the Old Country. For this test, DLSS is set to quality, with all of the additional graphics settings pushed to epic. Starting with 1440p, the average frame rate sits at around 68 FPS, with the 1% low at roughly 49 FPS. GPU power consumption is around 222 watts. CPU usage sits at about 45%, with an average power draw of roughly 44 watts. One interesting thing I noticed during testing is how sensitive the performance is to what's happening around you. I'm running the benchmark in this small village area with people, buildings, and quite a few objects around. But even without moving very far, a small change in the scene can make a pretty big difference. In one spot, the frame rate can stay close to 60 FPS, while just a little further away, it can jump to around 75 FPS. So performance in Mafia can vary quite a lot, even within the same area. In 4K, the average frame rate drops to around 52 FPS, with the 1% low sitting at roughly 41 FPS. So we're below the 60 FPS mark here. And there were also a few moments where the frame rate dropped to around 45 FPS. As we saw at 1440p, performance can change quite a bit depending on exactly what's happening in the scene. GPU power consumption increases to around 265 watts. CPU usage drops to about 37%, with an average power draw of roughly 40 watts. Overall, 4K at these settings is definitely playable, but if you want to stay closer to 60 FPS more consistently, you'll probably need to reduce some settings or use a more aggressive DLSS mode. Moving on, we have Ghost of Tsushima. For this test, DLSS is set to quality, with the graphics preset set to very high. And as always, keep in mind that performance can vary quite a lot depending on the scene. Here, we're looking at the beginning of the game, where there's already quite a lot happening on screen. At 1440p, the average frame rate sits at around 156 FPS, with the 1% low at roughly 130 FPS, so performance is extremely smooth. Average GPU power consumption is around 265 watts. CPU usage stays relatively low at around 32%, with an average power draw of roughly 39 watts. What's interesting here is that GPU usage averages only around 85%. So at 1440p, the RTX 5080 isn't being fully utilized in this particular scene. There seems to be another limitation somewhere in the system or game engine preventing the GPU from being pushed to its full potential. But even so, we're already getting well over 150 FPS. In 4K, the average frame rate drops to around 123 FPS, with the 1% low sitting at roughly 102 FPS. That's still an excellent result, and the game feels extremely smooth at this resolution. GPU power consumption increases quite a bit to around 323 watts, and this time GPU usage reaches around 99%, so the RTX 5080 is finally being pushed close to its full potential. CPU usage drops slightly to around 27%, with an average power draw of roughly 36 watts. Overall, Ghost of Tsushima runs extremely well in 4K on this setup. We're still getting well above 100 FPS, even with DLSS quality and the very high preset. Now it's time for The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered. As always, let's start with the settings. DLSS is set to quality, with the highest available preset, very high. I don't know about you, but I really like the beginning of this game. The calm atmosphere, the scenery, and all the nature around you just look beautiful. Anyway, moving on to performance, at 1440p, we're getting around 130 FPS on average, with the 1% low sitting at roughly 94 FPS. Average GPU power consumption is around 262 watts. CPU usage is quite high here, averaging around 51%, with a power draw of roughly 51 watts. And one interesting thing happens near the end of this section. As we ride through the stream, CPU usage suddenly jumps to over 90%. So even within the same area, certain moments can put a much heavier load on the processor. In 4K, performance is still excellent. The average frame rate sits at around 105 FPS, with the 1% low at roughly 79 FPS. So the game remains very smooth even at this resolution. GPU power consumption increases to around 299 watts. What's interesting is that CPU usage stays almost exactly the same as in 1440p, at around 51%, with an average power draw of roughly 49 watts. So even in 4K, The Last of Us Part 2 Remastered still keeps the processor quite busy instead of shifting almost all of the workload to the graphics card. Overall, the RTX 5080 handles 4K really well here, delivering well over 100 FPS while using DLSS quality and the very high preset. The second to last game in today's episode is Horizon Forbidden West. As usual, we're using DLSS quality with the built-in very high preset. At 1440p, performance is really strong. We're getting around 147 FPS on average, with the 1% low at roughly 104 FPS, so the gameplay feels extremely smooth. Average GPU power consumption sits at around 272 watts. As you can see on the overlay, this game also keeps the CPU pretty busy. Average CPU usage is around 59%, with a power draw of roughly 54 watts. And what's interesting is that this doesn't really disappear when we move up to 4K. As you'll see in a moment, the CPU is still doing quite a lot of work even at the higher resolution. In 4K, performance remains really good. The average frame rate sits at around 111 FPS, with the 1.0 low at roughly 72 FPS. GPU power consumption increases to around 298 watts. CPU usage drops slightly, but still stays fairly high at around 51%, with an average power draw of roughly 50 watts. In many games, moving to 4K reduces the CPU workload quite noticeably, but Horizon Forbidden West still keeps the processor relatively busy here. Overall though, we're still getting well over 100 FPS at 4K with DLSS quality and the very high preset, which is a really strong result. Today's episode closes with Halo Campaign Evolved. For this test, we're using the Ultra preset with DLSS set to Ultra. At first glance, you can already see that the game is fairly demanding. At 1440p, the average frame rate stays just below 100 FPS, at around 95 FPS, with the 1% low at roughly 72 FPS. GPU power consumption is relatively low, at around 235 watts. CPU usage sits at about 38%, with an average power draw of roughly 42 watts, so the processor still has a fair amount of work to do here. In 4K, performance drops quite a bit compared to 1440p, but the game still stays above 60 FPS during this section. We're getting around 66 FPS on average, with the 1% low at roughly 54 FPS. GPU power consumption increases to around 287 watts. CPU usage drops slightly to about 33%, with an average power draw of roughly 40 watts. In terms of gameplay though, the experience is really smooth, and for a shooter like Halo, that's probably what matters most. At first, you might stop and look at the textures, lighting, and all the little visual details, but once the action starts, all of that quickly moves into the background. What matters more to me at that point is how responsive the game feels, how satisfying the shooting is, and whether the whole experience keeps you immersed in the action. And here, Halo does that really well. That was the last game in today's episode. Before we finish, here's a quick summary of all 10 games we tested today. If you enjoyed the video, leave a like, and don't forget to subscribe so you won't miss the next benchmark. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next one.